Hello again, it's the Employee of the Month, and I'd like to take a departure today, if I might, and speak to something that's been kind of thrust into my world. I really had no connection with it other than I knew of it in a very vague way through the news media. I had no energy about it one way or the other. At the time, I was busy with my normative living, but it was kind of handed to me in a way by someone whom I'll not name, and in a way in which I'll leave unnamed as well in the location. It's to do with this controversy that has suddenly surfaced in the southern United States regarding the Confederate flag and the display of it. As a Christian, there are some things I think, it seems to me, if we're going to be honest before the Lord, whom we say we serve, that we have to take into account as we look at situations such as this, wherein a symbol of certain heritage in our minds becomes so important to us that we're willing to lay aside some of the things that we're commanded in Scripture to do and be. I'd like to read just a couple of little passages today in setting the stage for all of my comments here. The first one I'll not read, I'll just paraphrase. Paul says to the church at Corinth that we as believers, our warfare is not against flesh and blood, that is, not against people. And the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. And he says that we should take all thoughts captive to Christ. Now that's one of those little passages that is deliberately instructive and can pass through time, not just into the time into which Paul writes it in the 50s AD, but through time to the present day, and instruct us today fully without any real additional context. It's one of those passages that is fully instructive to us right now. We are to take all thoughts captive to Christ. Well, the question is, are we really doing that? Paul says also to the church at Colossae, he says, and again, taking the ideation that we now belong to Jesus. He is our leader now. The allegiance to Him is the primary, the preeminent allegiance. And he says this, don't lie to one another, speaking to the ethics under which we should now live, since you have put off the old nature with its deeds, and have put on the new nature, which is renewed in the knowledge according to the image of God who created that new nature, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. This passage, and this little grouping of passages, to me at least, seems very, very clear that for us, once we are called out and called to be believers, that everything about our world then, we now look through different lenses at this world. And the choices that we make will be filtered by those lenses of we are called to belong to Him first. I was raised here in the South, and I grew up, I can remember vividly going to sit during assembly times in my school, in elementary school, when we would be called in to watch a film. At that time, of course, the film came on reels about this big around, and that would be just 30 minutes of film. And they would set it all up and get the projector going, and we would sit, and the first thing would be the GEA imagery, and that logo would come up on the screen, and immediately Dixie would start to play, and there would be the image of the Confederate flag in the films, and it was part of the flag of Georgia at the time. And so I grew up with this as a Southern child with no sense of controversy here at all. When I reached the 5th grade, the schools were integrated, and still as a young child raised in a common, typical Southern home, there was no sense of controversy for me then either, even though now I had African American friends at school with whom I played sports and everything else that we engaged in class. So I went through my schooling life, and then in 1982 I became a Christian. I surrendered to Jesus and what He had done for me on the cross and asked Him to become my Lord. Well, it didn't take very long before a lot of the things that I had grown up with in an innocent way, with no sense of question about them as far as the ethical importance was concerned, I started to have some of those elements of my life challenged one at a time, and that challenge goes on right up to this present day. But one thing I was challenged about early on was the climate of racial distinction in which I grew up. I grew up in a home that was racially isolated, although I was in a school where that racial isolation did not take place. But now I was being confronted with the fact that I had grown up that way. And I began to see that these texts like this one that I have read today are those texts which challenge culture, and they bring a new meta-narrative to the believer. And the meta-narrative is Jesus and his requirements, his way of living, what he requires of us as followers. That is the meta-narrative under which everything else must fall. And that includes things like this allegiance to the Confederate flag. I have a friend of mine who's a pastor, and while he was in seminary, he had a roommate who was taking the same classes. They ate together, they lived together, they preached to one another in their preaching practicums, they attended the same classes, graduated together, as a matter of fact. And he was giving his roommate a ride one day. The roommate walked in front of my friend's car and realized there was a Confederate flag on the bumper. He'd never noticed it before. He got into the car. My pastor friend said my roommate became very quiet. And of course, when you're good friends, you ask, what's the matter? Well, the roommate expressed to him that he'd never noticed the Confederate flag on the front. Well, my friend, the pastor, was just oblivious. He said, well, I don't understand. It's just that I'm from the South. All of this Southern heritage and whatnot. Well, the roommate said, yes, I understand that from you, and I believe you, but I want you to know that when I look at that flag, I, as an African American, see only one thing: slavery. My pastor friend said he thought about that for a little while, and he said, you know, if I'm really being honest with myself, now that I've been confronted in this way about something that heretofore I'd been completely innocent in, he said, I knew I had to take that off my car. And he said, I did so. I took it off. There comes a point at which, if we're saying that we're followers of Jesus, that everything has to fit under that meta-narrative of discipleship. And the Confederate flag, or even the American flag, is one of those. Now, I realize I'm treading into tall grass here, and I don't want to go there. That might be for another posting. I love this country. I believe that we are to be, just as the Bible tells us, obedient to the authorities of the country. However, when one says yes to Jesus, there is a line in the sand. And that line in the sand is drawn between ourselves and the laws, or ourselves and the culture more specifically, wherein cultural adherence will bring disfavor to the name of God in this world. When that happens, we have to stay behind that line and say, I'll not cross that one. Well, it seems to me that this allegiance to the Confederate flag falls squarely within that kind of question. First of all, in a pluralistic country, all of us have the right to express ourselves, and Southern heritage, whatever that is perfectly within the boundaries of those rights to express it via flying the Confederate flag, or wearing it on a lapel, or having it on your car bumper, whatever that is that a person feels they must do. However, for those of us who would do such things and then sit in a church pew, I'm offering this not as a way of accusing anybody of anything, but saying, please, can we not look seriously at who we are as followers of Jesus, and in that serious examination say, is this something that is proper for me to hold such strong allegiance for in my life, knowing that there may be those who are just as much under the lordship of Jesus as I am, who are deeply offended by me taking the liberty that I do have to fly that flag or to display it. Paul says it very clearly. Yes, we have liberty. There are doctrines of people. Touch not, taste not, handle not. Doctrines of people, the elementary principles that are to go away now that we've been set free by the gospel. I understand that. But he also says, I'll never use my liberty if my liberty offends someone. I will restrict myself in that liberty and the exercise of it. He speaks about drinking wine and eating meat. I'll never eat meat, he says, if it means that I'm going to offend someone who might otherwise become under the lordship of Jesus and become saved. So we have a higher calling than the Confederate flag. Now, I want to say to the people who are offended by that flag, I understand your offense, and I think you are absolutely and perfectly justified to be offended by it. That is an element of my heritage as a Southerner that I am deeply ashamed of, and I make no bones about that at all. We kept slaves, and I am sorry for that chapter in the life of the heritage from which I come. But I'm going to also ask of you who are offended to please forgive us our childishness. Now, I use that word because, as far as I'm concerned as an adult, that if I were to see myself going to bat for such a thing as a flag and its display and the freedom to display it, why am I doing it? Am I doing it because I truly feel an adherence to the plurality of culture that I live in and I want to maintain the liberty of that plurality? Or is there something else going on? It's one thing to hold to the plurality and want to defend it. That's a good thing. We've had people dying for many, many decades now for that very reason. To defend the freedom for us to be foolish. But as a Christian, I can't afford that foolishness. I have a higher calling. I have a Lord who is Lord over all, not just Lord over Caucasians. And I have friends who are African American to this day who I know would be deeply offended if I were to fly such a flag. And so for me, it's a non-issue. I'll not do that if that's going to offend someone who is a brother or a sister in the Lord. I am willing to lay that liberty aside and restrict myself on account of bringing good reputation to the name of God in this world. And so I appeal to you all out there, of whom I am one, that if you are so strongly insistent on flying that flag, if you are a Christian, and I'm obviously not speaking to someone who's not a believer. If you're not a believer, disregard this entire affair, although I would love to see you become a believer. However, if you're a believer and you're part of this movement to see this flag maintained and flown and displayed for whatever reason, I appeal to you to rethink it and allow the filter of the fact that you call yourself a follower of Jesus and the meta-narrative of discipleship in your life to temper that allegiance to that flag and to ask yourself the really hard question, where is my allegiance? I, for one, don't want to stand before God having an allegiance that strips me of the reputation that might bring someone else into the fold of believership. If someone else is going to be so offended by my behavior that they look at me as a Christian and say, if that's what a Christian is like, I don't want to be one of those, then if it's a behavior like this, flying this flag, then I'm going to let it go as though it were a hot potato. I'm not going to hold on to it because I'm commanded by Scripture very clearly. And so for those who out there who feel that way, that they must hold to this flag, I'm going to ask you to be honest with yourself. You know why it is that people in our culture, in this pluralistic culture, would be offended by that flag. You know why it is. Regardless of the reasons that you might display or let out as to why you feel it's so important to cling to that flag, you know that it offends people and you know exactly why. And so I'm appealing to you, please, for the sake of your calling as a believer, please examine yourself and find out whether you're truly in the faith. And if a person, I'll say this as an acid test, if a person is so convinced that the flying of that flag is more important than the calling they have in Jesus, then I'm with Paul when I say to you, examine yourself and see whether or not you truly are in the faith. You'll have to stand before God with that. That's something to think about. So to the brothers and sisters who are offended by that flag, please forgive us our foolishness. For those who insist on flying it, examine yourself and see whether or not you're in the faith. And if you are, allow the discipleship that you claim to have under Jesus to cause you to rethink whether or not that flag is as important as you think it is. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Employee of the Month. Until next time.